Are there advantages to aging? Yes, I am Debbi-Jo Horton, and welcome to Advantages to Aging. Join my guests and I as we discuss aging and what makes for a healthy lifestyle, which results in a quality life. Thank you for joining me today. Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Advantages to Aging. I'm your host, DJ Horton, and today I have a special lady with us. And you don't know it, but you are grateful for her just as much as I am grateful for her because she produces all of these podcasts. Welcome to the show, Tiffany Mason, the driving force behind Virtually You. She is incredible. Welcome, Tiffany.
Well, thank you very much, Debbi-Jo. The pleasure has been all mine.
It's mutual, totally mutual. So I have been talking with a lot of people of all different ages, and the common thread of most of those conversations that I've been having lately is podcasting, either listening to great podcasts or, like I'm looking to be a guest on podcasts, or I'm thinking maybe I should be, starting my own podcast. Like, what do you recommend? And so I thought, let's ask the expert to kind of take us through some pros and cons of all of those things.
Sure.
So let's start in the easy place. Being a guest on a podcast. What do you recommend to people who are looking to be a guest on a podcast?
Well, first and foremost, everybody out there, please use headphones. So the biggest thing with headphones is it does not matter the quality of the headphones. It prevents audio from coming out of a computer and giving feedback, or what we call in the industry, microphone bleed. And so it's great for your editor, but it's also really great if this is something you're doing on your own. It will erase a lot of headaches that you could potentially have with having the microphone bleed. Second of all, guesting is one of the number one ways right now to promote your business. Some people that don't even have podcasts, that's their main business growth strategy. They are trying to get on all these podcasts because the reality is, Debbi-Jo, me being on your podcast, now I'm getting exposure to all of your listeners. You go on another podcast, you get exposure of all those listeners. So that's great. One thing that I do when I publish your episodes is I always say Debbi-Jo Horton with, and then I put whoever your guest is. When they go into any of the platforms, the listening platforms to catch an episode, and let's say that they don't remember your name, or let's say they follow somebody and they're like, I want to listen to every podcast that person has been on. It's going to pull up. So let's say they want to look for every episode that Tiffany Mason has been on. It's going to pull up your episode and any other episode that I have guested on, giving your podcast exposure. So there's a lot of benefits to being a guest on a podcast, sharing your expertise with an audience that usually has a similar taste. So my podcast is about music. So everyone that's going to be on my podcast is going to talk about music. And then my audience is going to appreciate what they have to say because they're there because they want to listen to information about music. So there's a lot of audience sharing, I suppose, going on.
Yeah, that's a great point. And by the way, I have been on Tiffany's podcast. So you'll have to go listen to the podcast Live Like You Are Dying. I remember which song it was.
Yes, and I will link it in the show notes for you
Awesome.
guys.
Okay, so let's say, I'm thinking that I've been a parent with all kinds of parenting challenges that I've managed to get through, and I really want to share that. And I'm thinking maybe I should start my own podcast. So what are the pros and cons of doing it all yourself versus using a professional like yourself?
The biggest difference that you're going to notice is accountability. So, I set up a Trello board for all of my clients and I say, the audio is due on this date. I'm going to publish it on this date. And I'm going to check in with people. If I don't have that audio, I give about 5 to 7 day leeway time. And if I don't have it by then, I'm like, hey, where's this recording? Are you thinking that you want to do something different? Do you want to reuse an episode? So two things. Accountability, where I'm going to say, is this ready for editing and publishing? That's going to result in consistency. So your podcast is going out each and every time. Also, the benefit of having a podcast manager or producer is an expert in your back pocket. So each time you come up against something, I know you've sent me a couple of emails where people are kind of phishing or spamming and saying, hey, you're on this chart list and you're number two. Do you want to advertise with us? And it's like, you can reach out to me and be like, is this legit or dumb? And I can say, no, pass on that. They're just trying to get you to, give them, more business. It's also, especially now, really incorporating a lot of AI. So, how can we most effectively incorporate AI into all of our clients' podcasts? Yes, you can do that to some extent. There are some platforms that let you do all those things. They are efficient. But, I was looking at the script today and there's a few things I want to incorporate from there. The reality is some people breathe before an some people breathe after an and some people breathe before and after an So it's important to know that. And then if you say, okay, take every out, now you have an inhale and exhale between two words. So it doesn't sound right. It's like something's missing. So sometimes the timing is off on that. Also, sometimes people start a sentence and they almost stutter like that. And so it's easy for me to go in and erase that duplication, where if you're doing it on your own, you wouldn't know to take that out. The other thing is it can level some of the audio, but it may not be able to take out some of the background noises, where a professionally trained podcast producer, editor can do that. So yes, there's a lot of things out there to help an indie podcaster do it on their own. The additional benefits are the expert in your back pocket, accountability, consistency, and someone who's really keeping up with the industry and can advise you on things that are coming to you.
That's an excellent point. I know a lot of people who do it all on their own, and there is definitely a quality difference when you listen to their podcast versus a podcast that happens to be professionally produced. And that's not to knock anybody. Sometimes you oftentimes feel that, well, I need to do it myself because I need to make it as inexpensive as possible. But if the reality is that you're using the podcast to drive business, you need to think about the quality of your podcast representing the quality of the work that you do and whatever it is that you do to make money, right?
Agreed.
So you don't want to do here and there kind of podcasts, because what you're giving in terms of the impression that you're giving is that my services are hit or miss.
Well, I also think that it's a due diligence to your guest. So if you are interviewing, to uphold your integrity and their integrity, and another point to add to doing it on your own. And of course, if that is where you're at, I would always say done is better than perfection. As you grow, consider, getting somebody to help you. I find a lot of people struggle with the outro and the intro. First of all, having the copyright free music to go with the outro and intro, what to say during the outro and intro. And usually those are pre recorded bits. And so lots of times, beginning podcaster doesn't understand how to import the intro, connect it to the main content, and then connect the outro. So there's some technicality that can be a little bit tricky if it's something that you're not used to. Plus, there's a huge learning curve, and you got to go on, watch all the YouTube videos or watch all the videos for the platform that you're going to be using for your podcast. Whereas you really could just say, hey, I have this audio. Can you turn it into a podcast? And I say, with my little magic wand, but of course. Ta-da!
Yeah. And I love that you do that. The other thing that you mentioned was consistency. And I'm sure I'm not unique in the fact that when I listen to podcasts, I want to know, like, if it's a weekly podcast, that it's going to automatically appear in my list and I'm going to be able to listen to it. And if all of a sudden that podcast goes on hiatus, I may or may not notice that it's no longer in my list. And when I do, it's almost like you feel like you've been dissed. right? Like, oh, you're not good enough to listen to my stuff anymore, so I'm not going to produce for you. And then I sit there and go like, did they stop?
Yeah.
So when thinking about that, because I was having a conversation with someone over coffee this morning about, it gets posted when it gets posted. Sometimes it's weekly, sometimes it'll go months with no, nothing, and then you
Mm.
might get 3 in a week. And I was thinking that I almost feel like you're doing it for yourself versus you're doing it for an audience.
Mm.
Right? So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think about it. If you're talking to your kids and you're trying to teach them a lesson, or you're trying to develop a skill or a quality in them, and then all of a sudden you stop, it almost gives the impression that, well, what I was saying before isn't important anymore. So you can disregard it.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
if if it is that, it's got to fit into your schedule, and let's face it, I'm a busy gal. I have multiple businesses, and when I was starting to think about, well, do I really have time to have an episode drop every other week, I reached out to my gal Tiff and said, so we just passed 3 years, we haven't had a single repeat episode. I've got a lot going on, not just in my businesses, but in my personal life. We'll talk about that more on another episode. And maybe we just, run a couple of reruns. Well, I have to say that when she was trying to say to me, oh, don't worry about it, we can totally do that, 1 or 2 of them, I went, what does that say about me? That I'm a rerun? No, I don't think so. I'm going to figure out a way to make it work. Hence, how do you decide whether or not you do the podcast, you don't do the podcast, you do it yourself, or you hire a professional? Came to be. So, Tiffany, if someone really feels that they have to do it themselves, what are some of the platforms that they could be using that are most helpful? And what are some of the ones that maybe they should stay away from?
Okay, well, really quick, I'm going to backpedal. And I want to say, as far as accountability, it's funny how we will let ourselves down, but we will not let somebody else down. So lots of times when people see these Trello boards, they're like, wait a minute, Tiffany's counting on this audio. Tiffany needs this audio to produce. What will Tiffany think if I don't have the audio ready? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that if you are not being consistent and you said like how you miss an episode and then, 3 weeks later you post an episode, it's likely they find another podcast and it takes this place of your podcast. So think about that, not even just, what does it say about you? Are you doing the podcast for yourself or for your audience? They may find somebody as a replacement if you are not consistent. And then as far as frequency, people are always like, what should I do? And I want to encourage everybody, if you're doing it on your own and you say, you know what, I have capacity to do it 1 time a month, release 1 time a month. If you find, you know what, I can do once, let me bump up to 2 times a month. That's great. But what we don't like to see is people to start out for a month and then realize, wait a minute, this is so much work, and then get really sporadic and then lose their complete consistency, and then they're one here and there, and that is a worse look per se than if you did one and then you're like, you know what, everyone loves this content, I'm going to bump up to 2. You guys have been such a great audience, now I'm doing 1 a week. That's a lot more of a positive message. As far as platforms that people can be using, there's one that's Podcastle, and they're supposed to have, like a complete, I guess, production studio for their podcasters. Just keep in mind, when you stop a word, you cut a word out, there's transitions that occur there. So just be mindful of that. Descript is great for the same thing. And there's a new one that I just found out about called Podflow. So those are 3 that I would probably look at. Ones to stay away from. I guess I don't really have anything that I would say stay away from. But if you are doing it on your own, you want to make sure that you can edit, level audio, have copyright free music, and be able to possibly create content at the end. So once you're done publishing, you can say, okay, now give me show notes. Okay, now give me social media content. Okay, now give me a blog post. So I would say look for an all-in-one. If you're going to invest, look for an all-in-one.
That's excellent advice. I didn't mean so much as to stay away from it because they're bad, but when you're first starting
Oh,
out, sometimes there
sure.
are some that are more complicated. And so if for a beginner, that
Mm,
might be one to kind of grow into, shall we say.
I guess I would say Descript, but I don't think any of them are quick, easy jump in. I think they all have a little bit of a learning curve because there's a lot that goes into podcasting. I mean, I think a lot of people think, oh, I'm going to start a podcast. And then they start looking at what really goes into it and they're like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize all the things I would need to do. Speaking of which, if anybody wants to, and if I have permission from Debbi-Jo, I'll link it in the show notes. I have a start your own podcast checklist. It's free. You guys can go on there, download it, and it would just give you really good food for thought, what you would consider if you wanted to start your own with me or without me, just if you want to start a podcast.
That would be an excellent gift for you to give to the listeners. And I'm hoping that this show has answered a lot of questions for you, but I'm sure that it's also produced a lot more questions. So before you jump in, make sure that you get all of your answers because there is nothing worse than getting into the middle of something and then going, oh my goodness, what did I get myself into? This gal was the one that kept insisting to me that I had a huge message to share and I should do it as a podcast and how easy it would be for me to do a podcast on my own. And I said, no way. If this is going to happen, it's going to be with you telling me exactly what needs to be done. I'm just going to record the interviews and I don't care what you do in the background as long as the podcast drops every other Monday. So I hope that you
Yeah.
had a lot to take away from this podcast, and we shall see you next week. Tiffany behind the scenes and myself as well, actually, I think the next one, you will see that I will be the guest and there'll be a guest host that will be interviewing me, kind of filling you in with what's been going on in my life on the advantages to aging. Until next time, be safe.
Do you think one of the biggest advantages to aging is all the knowledge we gain along the way? Me too. What did you learn today? Share with me in my Facebook group with the same name as this podcast, Advantages to Aging. Now hit subscribe so you don't miss all the tips to come in future episodes.